She was a name whispered in the palace corridors, a shadow behind the throne. Her story is woven into the fabric of a kingdom, tied forever to a great king's devastating fall and the unlikely rise of his wisest son. This is the story of Bathsheba, the woman who unknowingly held the future of a nation in her hands. Our story begins not with her, but with a king, King David, a name that rang like a victory bell throughout the land of Israel. He was the shepherd boy who had faced a giant, the warrior who had united the tribes, the poet whose songs reached the heavens. By now, he was no longer a boy. He was a man in his prime, a ruler at the peak of his power, secure on his throne in the city he had conquered, Jerusalem. It was the time of year when kings go off to war. The fields were green, the air was warm, and the armies of Israel marched out to battle their enemies. But this year, for the first time in a long time, King David did not go with them. He sent his mighty general, Joab, and all his best soldiers, but the king himself stayed behind. Perhaps he felt he had earned a rest. Perhaps the comforts of the palace had grown too sweet to leave. Whatever the reason, David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the hills, casting long shadows across the city, David found himself unable to sleep. He rose from his bed and walked out onto the flat roof of his palace. It was his private vantage point, a place where he could look out over the city he had built. The air was cool and carried the faint scent of jasmine and baking bread from the homes below. The sounds of the city were quieting for the night, the distant bleating of a sheep, the murmur of a family's conversation, the clatter of a closing shutter. He looked down upon the rooftops of his people, a sea of clay and stone under the emerging stars. And that is when he saw her. On a nearby roof, a woman was bathing. In the soft, fading light of dusk, she was a figure of quiet grace. The moonlight seemed to find her, illuminating her form as she poured water over her shoulders. David stopped. His breath caught in his throat. He knew he should turn away. He knew it was wrong to look. A voice deep inside him, the same voice that had guided him for years, whispered, "Look away, my king. This is not for you." But another voice, a newer, more demanding one, spoke louder. He was the king, after all. Did he not deserve whatever he desired? He had fought for this kingdom, bled for it. He watched, mesmerized, as she moved with an elegance that seemed to set her apart from everyone else in the city. He felt a powerful curiosity, a pull he could not, or would not, resist. Who is she? He thought. He had to know. He turned from the edge of the roof and called for a servant. His heart was pounding, a strange mix of excitement and unease churning within him. "Find out who that woman is," he commanded, his voice a little too sharp. The servant bowed and hurried away, leaving the king alone with his thoughts in the growing darkness. The cool night air suddenly felt hot, and the peace he had felt moments before was gone, replaced by a restless, consuming fire. The servant returned a short time later, his face carefully blank. "My king," he said, bowing low. "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam. She is the wife of Uriah the Hittite." The words hung in the air. The wife of Uriah. Not just any man, but one of his own. Uriah was one of David's most loyal and courageous soldiers, a member of his elite guard, known as the Mighty Men. He was at the front lines right now, fighting for his king, for his kingdom. For a moment, David hesitated. This was not just wrong, it was a betrayal. It was a violation of trust, a breaking of the sacred bond between a king and his loyal soldier. The name, Uriah, should have been like a splash of icy water, waking him from his trance. But the image of Bathsheba was burned into his mind. The desire was too strong, and it silenced the voice of wisdom. He made a decision that would change everything. "Bring her to me," David said, his voice low and steady, betraying none of the storm inside him. The royal guards arrived at Bathsheba's door. The heavy knock echoed in the quiet street. When she opened it, her heart likely leaped with fear. What could the king's personal guard want with her? Had something happened to Uriah? Was he hurt? The captain of the guard did not offer an explanation. He simply said, "The king wishes to see you. You must come with us now." Imagine her confusion, her fear, as she was escorted through the winding streets of Jerusalem. The torches of the guards cast dancing, ominous shadows on the walls. What had she done? What did the most powerful man in the nation want with her, the wife of a simple soldier? She was led into the palace, a place of stunning wealth she had likely only ever seen from the outside. The polished stone floors, the rich tapestries, the scent of expensive oils, it was another world. She was brought before the king. He was not dressed in his royal robes or his armor. He was a man, and he looked at her with an intensity that made her feel small and powerless. What could she do? He was the king. To refuse him was unthinkable. It could mean disgrace, exile, or worse, not just for her, but for her entire family. She was trapped by his power, a small boat caught in the current of a mighty river. That night, a terrible mistake was made. A king forgot who he was, and a woman was left to carry the weight of his failure. Afterwards, Bathsheba was sent back to her home. The palace gates closed behind her, and she was alone again in the darkness. But everything was different now. The quiet of her house was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with a dreadful secret. The life she had known, the simple honor of being a soldier's wife, was shattered. She was left with nothing but shame and a deep, gnawing fear of what was to come. For now, there was only silence. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that their secret would not stay hidden for long. Weeks turned into a month. The sun rose and set over Jerusalem. The armies of Israel were still at war, and Uriah was still at the front. For David, life in the palace continued. He met with advisors, settled disputes, and ate from golden plates. He tried to push the memory of that night from his mind, to bury it under the weight of his daily duties. He almost succeeded. He almost convinced himself that it was a small thing, a fleeting moment that would have no consequences. But for Bathsheba, every day was a countdown. Every morning she woke with a knot of dread in her stomach. She carried a secret that was not just in her heart, but was growing within her. The signs became undeniable. She was with child. The fear she had felt on the night she was summoned to the palace was nothing compared to the terror that gripped her now. This was a catastrophe. She was a married woman, and her husband had been gone for months. When the child was born, everyone would know. The law was clear and brutal. She would be seen as unfaithful, a woman who had disgraced her husband and her family. The punishment was death. Her life, and the life of her unborn child, hung by a thread. She had only one person to turn to, the one person who shared her secret and held the power to save her. She sent a message to the palace. It was short, a desperate plea disguised in just a few words. She could not write the whole truth, for who knew what eyes might see the message. She wrote only what was necessary, trusting the king would understand the terror behind the simple statement. A scribe delivered the small, folded parchment to King David. He opened it. The message read, "I am going to have a child." David's world tilted. The secret he had tried so hard to bury had just broken through the ground. The consequence he had ignored was now staring him in the face. Panic set in. This was not just about him anymore. It was about Bathsheba, an innocent woman caught in his web. It was about his reputation. He was the king, the righteous judge of Israel, the man of God. If this story came out, his authority would crumble. He would be a hypocrite, a disgrace. He had to fix this. He had to be clever. His mind raced, searching for a solution, a way to cover the tracks of his sin. And then, an idea came to him. It was a simple plan, deceptively simple. He would bring Uriah home from the war. He would tell the loyal soldier to go to his house, to be with his wife. Then, when the child was born, everyone would assume it was Uriah's. The secret would be safe forever. It was a perfect plan. It was a dishonest plan, built on a foundation of lies, but David was desperate. He sent a royal command to his general, Joab, at the battlefront. "Send Uriah the Hittite to me." Joab, suspecting nothing, obeyed immediately. A few days later, Uriah arrived at the palace, dusty and weary from the road, but with his back straight and his eyes bright. He stood before his king, the very picture of loyalty. "My king, you sent for me?" he asked, his voice full of respect. David put on a mask of casual concern. "Uriah, my faithful soldier, tell me, how's the war going? How's Joab? How are the men?" He feigned interest, asking about the siege, the enemy's strength, the morale of the troops. Uriah gave a full and honest report, speaking with pride about the army of Israel. He was a good man, a true soldier. David listened, nodding, but his mind was on his scheme. When Uriah finished his report, David smiled warmly. "You have done well, Uriah. You must be tired from your journey. Go down to your house now. Rest. Wash your feet. Be with your wife." As a gesture of royal favor, David even sent a gift of food from the palace kitchen to Uriah's house. He watched him go, a small smile of satisfaction on his face. The problem was solved. By morning, Uriah would have been home, and the timeline would be plausibly set. David slept better that night than he had in weeks. But when he awoke the next morning, his servants brought him bewildering news. "My king, Uriah did not go home last night. He slept at the entrance to the palace with the rest of the king's servants. David was stunned. This was not part of the plan. He summoned Uriah at once. "What is this?" David asked, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. "You just came from a long journey. Why did you not go home?" Uriah's reply was a blade that cut straight to David's conscience. He stood tall and said, "The Ark of the Covenant and the armies of Israel and Judah are staying in tents. My commander, Joab, and all my fellow soldiers are camped in the open fields. How could I then go to my house to eat and drink and be with my wife? As surely as you live, my king, I will not do this thing." The honor of this man was a blazing light, and it exposed the darkness in David's own heart. Uriah, a foreigner, a Hittite, had more integrity than the king of Israel. He would not accept comfort while his brothers in arms were suffering. David was shamed by Uriah's nobility, but his shame quickly turned to a deeper, more stubborn desperation. His clever plan had failed. He had to try something else. That evening, David invited Uriah to eat with him at the royal table. He poured him wine, and then more wine, encouraging him to drink. David's new plan was simple: get Uriah so drunk that his resolve would weaken, so drunk that he would stumble home to his wife without thinking. All night, David laughed and told stories, filling Uriah's cup again and again. Finally, the loyal soldier was staggering. David dismissed him, certain that this time he would surely go home. But David had underestimated the man's character. Even in his drunkenness, Uriah's loyalty held firm. He did not go home. He stumbled out of the king's dining hall and went back to his mat among the palace servants, and there he fell into a heavy sleep. When David heard the news the next morning, a cold dread filled him. His plans had failed. His attempts to cover his sin had only revealed the shining goodness of the man he was trying to deceive. The panic was now a roaring beast inside him. There was no way to hide the truth as long as Uriah was alive. A dark thought, a terrible and final solution, began to form in the king's mind. If he could not trick Uriah, he would have to remove him. It was a monstrous thought, the thought of a tyrant, not a shepherd king. But the fear of exposure was greater than the fear of God. With a heavy heart and hands that trembled slightly, David sat down and wrote a letter. It was addressed to his general, Joab. He sealed it with the royal seal. Then he called for Uriah. The soldier, now sober and clear-eyed, came and stood before him. "Uriah," David said, his voice betraying nothing, "take this letter back to General Joab." He handed the folded parchment to Uriah. Uriah took it, bowed, and said, "Yes, my king." He had no idea what was written inside. He had no idea that he was holding his own death warrant. He put the letter securely in his satchel, turned, and began his journey back to the war, a loyal soldier to the very end, carrying the king's treacherous command. The letter was short and brutal. It read, "Put Uriah in the front line where the fighting is fiercest. Then pull back from him, so that he will be struck down and die." He was ordering the murder of one of his best men, the husband of the woman he had taken. David, the man after God's own heart, had become a conspirator, a liar, and a murderer. He had fallen so far, so fast. Uriah arrived back at the camp and delivered the letter to Joab. The tough, battle-hardened general read the king's order. He must have been shocked, but a soldier's first duty is to obey. Joab did as he was commanded. During the next assault on the enemy city, he assigned Uriah to a place he knew was heavily defended. The fighting there was desperate and bloody. At the critical moment, Joab ordered the Israelite soldiers around Uriah to retreat. Uriah, left exposed and alone, fought bravely. But he was overwhelmed. He fell on the battlefield, a victim not of the enemy's sword, but of his own king's sin. When the battle was over, Joab sent a messenger to David with a report of the fighting. He told the messenger exactly what to say. When you have finished giving your report to the king, he may become angry and ask, "Why did you get so close to the city wall? Did you not know they would shoot arrows from the wall?" If he asks this, then you are to add, "And your servant, Uriah the Hittite, is dead also." The messenger raced to Jerusalem and delivered the news to David, just as Joab had instructed. David listened to the report of the battle, of the men who had been lost. He put on a convincing show of a king accepting the grim realities of war. Then the messenger delivered the final line, "And your servant, Uriah the Hittite, is dead also." David's face remained a mask of regal calm. He said to the messenger, "Go back and tell Joab this. Do not let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as another. Tell him to press the attack and capture the city." He dismissed the messenger, his voice steady. The secret was safe now. The final obstacle had been removed. The news of Uriah's death was carried to Bathsheba. A messenger arrived at her door not with a summons from the king, but with the heartbreaking news that her husband, her brave and honorable husband, had fallen in battle. Her cry of grief was real. She had lost a good man. She mourned for him, as was the custom, her home filled with the sounds of weeping. She was now a widow, a victim of war, in the eyes of the world. When her period of mourning was over, King David sent for her again. This time, he did not summon her in secret in the dead of night. He brought her to the palace openly. He married her. To all of Jerusalem, it looked like a story of compassion. The good king, taking pity on the widow of one of his fallen heroes, giving her a home and a place of honor. She became his wife, and in time, she gave birth to a son. David held the baby boy in his arms. He had done it. He had navigated the crisis. He had what he wanted. His secret was buried deep, and his reputation was intact. He was the king. He was powerful. He was safe. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord, and God had seen everything. A new season arrived in Jerusalem. The child of David and Bathsheba was a few months old. In the palace, a fragile sense of normalcy had returned. David was busy with the affairs of his kingdom, and the dark deeds of the recent past were pushed to the back of his mind. He had convinced himself that the story was over, that the past was buried with Uriah on a forgotten battlefield. But secrets kept from men are not kept from God. And God decided it was time for the king to face the truth. He sent a man to the palace. Not a soldier or a politician, but a prophet. His name was Nathan. Nathan was a man who walked with God, whose ears were tuned to the whispers of heaven. He was not intimidated by crowns or thrones. He feared God more than he feared any king. Nathan requested an audience with David, and it was granted. The prophet walked into the great hall, his step steady, his eyes clear. He found the king seated on his throne, perhaps dispensing justice or hearing petitions from his people. David looked up and saw Nathan. He likely smiled, for Nathan was his advisor and, he thought, his friend. "Nathan, what news do you bring?" Nathan bowed respectfully, but his face was grim. He did not bring greetings or pleasantries. He came with a story. "My king," he began, his voice calm and serious, capturing the attention of everyone in the hall. "There were two men in a certain town, one rich and one poor." David leaned forward, intrigued. He was a king who prided himself on justice, and he loved a good parable. Nathan continued, his voice painting a vivid picture. "The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle. He had more than he could ever need. But the poor man had nothing, except one little ewe lamb he had bought." Nathan's voice softened as he described the lamb. He raised it himself. It grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. The hall was silent. Everyone could picture this poor man and his beloved lamb. They could feel the tenderness of that bond. David, the former shepherd, surely felt it most of all. He knew what it was to care for a single, helpless animal. Nathan's voice grew harder as he continued the story. "Now, a traveler came to the rich man's house, and the rich man wanted to prepare a meal for his guest. But he was unwilling to take one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare for the visitor. The injustice of it was plain. Instead, Nathan said, his voice ringing with accusation, he took the poor man's lamb, the only thing he had, and he prepared it for his guest." The story was over. A wave of outrage washed over David. His face flushed with anger. He slammed his fist on the arm of his throne. This was exactly the kind of injustice he hated. He was the king, the protector of the poor and the weak. He rose to his feet, his eyes flashing with righteous fury. "As surely as the Lord lives," he roared, his voice booming through the hall. "The man who did this deserves to die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and had no pity." The hall buzzed with the king's anger. He had passed his judgment, swift and severe. He stood there, a pillar of righteousness, ready to punish this cruel, selfish man. Nathan let the king's words hang in the air for a long moment. The prophet looked David straight in the eye. The whole world seemed to shrink until it was just 2 men, a king and a prophet, locked in a gaze. Then, Nathan raised his hand, pointed a finger directly at the king, and spoke 5 simple words that shattered the silence and brought David's world crashing down. "You are the man." The words struck David like a physical blow. He staggered back as if he had been hit. The air left his lungs. The angry, righteous king vanished, replaced by a man exposed, a man caught in the blinding light of truth. The hall, the throne, the servants, it all faded away. All he could hear was Nathan's voice, explaining the parable, piece by agonizing piece. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, I anointed you king over Israel. I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives. I gave you all Israel and Judah. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Every word was a reminder of God's goodness, of his incredible blessings. And every word made David's sin look even darker in comparison. Why, then, Nathan's voice thundered, did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword of the Ammonites and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with their sword. There it was. The secret was out. The sin he had tried to bury was now proclaimed in the open. David's defenses crumbled. There were no excuses, no justifications left. He was guilty. He was the rich man who had everything but stole the one precious thing a poor man had. Then Nathan delivered God's judgment, and it was as terrifying as it was just. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. It was a chilling prophecy. The violence David had used to get what he wanted would now become a permanent resident in his own family. His sin would echo through generations. But the judgment was not over. Nathan's voice lowered, but his words grew even more terrible. This is what the Lord says, out of your own household I am going to bring calamity upon you. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will lie with your wives in broad daylight. You did your deed in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel. The punishment would fit the crime. David's secret sin would be answered with a public humiliation. The shame he had tried so desperately to avoid would be magnified 1,000 times over. Finally, Nathan spoke of the most immediate consequence, the one that would cut David to the core. Because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord. The prophet said, his voice full of sorrow, the son born to you will die. The child, the innocent baby boy, a product of their sin, but loved nonetheless. He would be taken. This was the price. All the pride, all the power, all the arrogance drained out of David. He was left with nothing but the crushing weight of his guilt. He looked at Nathan, the man who had dared to speak truth to power, and he did not lash out. He did not call his guards. He did not deny the charge. He simply collapsed under the weight of his sin and spoke the words of a broken man. I have sinned against the Lord. His confession was simple, immediate, and total. In that moment, the king was gone, and only a repentant sinner remained. Nathan, seeing the genuine remorse in David's heart, delivered a final word from God, a word of mercy mixed with the sentence. The Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die, but the child will die. The prophet turned and left the hall, his work done. He left David standing alone, stripped of his pride, his kingdom suddenly a house of shadows. The king had been judged. And now, the long, painful wait for the sentence to be carried out was about to begin. The confrontation was over, but the consequences were only just starting to unfold. As Nathan had foretold, the child became ill. A sudden, fierce sickness fell upon the infant boy. David's heart was torn with grief and terror. He knew this was the hand of God, the fulfillment of the prophet's words. But he was a father, and he could not simply stand by and watch his son die. He had to do something. He had to appeal to the mercy of God. David began to plead for the child's life. He entered a period of intense fasting and prayer. He refused all food. He took off his royal robes and put on sackcloth, the rough, scratchy garment of mourning and repentance. He would not sleep in his bed. Instead, he went into a private room and lay all night on the bare ground. The elders of his court, his most trusted advisers, came to him. They stood over him, their faces filled with concern. My king, please, get up from the ground, they begged. You must eat something. You will make yourself sick. But David would not listen. He refused to rise. He refused to eat. He was wrestling with God, pouring out his heart, begging for a miracle. He hoped, against all hope, that his repentance, his suffering, might change God's mind. Perhaps, he must have thought, God will be gracious to me. Perhaps he will let the child live. The palace became a place of hushed whispers and anxious waiting. The servants tiptoed around, their eyes constantly turning to the room where the king lay on the floor and to the nursery where the small child fought for every breath. For 7 days, this vigil continued. 7 days of fasting. 7 days of prayer. 7 days of a king humbling himself in the dust. On the seventh day, the child died. The servants in the palace were terrified. They didn't know what to do. They had seen the king's extreme grief while the child was still alive. Look, they whispered to one another, while the child was living, we spoke to him, and he wouldn't listen to us. How can we tell him the child is dead? He might do something terrible to himself. They were afraid his grief would consume him completely. They huddled together, speaking in low voices, trying to decide who would carry the dreadful news. But David, even in his grief-stricken state, was perceptive. He had been a commander of men, a leader who could read the faces of his soldiers. He saw his servants whispering. He saw the looks they exchanged, the fear in their eyes. And he knew. The waiting was over. He pushed himself up from the floor. His body was weak from a week of fasting, but his voice was clear. He looked at his servants and asked a simple, direct question. Is the child dead? They could not meet his eyes. They looked at the ground and mumbled, he is dead. A great stillness seemed to fall over David. The servants braced themselves for an outcry, a torrent of grief, a collapse. But David's reaction stunned them all. He did not tear his clothes or cry out in anguish. Instead, he stood up. He went and washed his face. He put on fresh clothes and anointed his head with oil. He took off the sackcloth of mourning and put on the garments of a man re-entering life. Then he did the most unexpected thing of all. He went to the house of the Lord, the tabernacle, and he bowed down and worshipped. When he returned to the palace, he said to his servants, prepare some food for me. They brought him a meal, and he sat down and ate. His servants were completely bewildered. This was the opposite of what they expected. They gathered around him, their faces a mixture of relief and confusion. What is this you have done? They asked him. While the child was alive, you fasted and wept. But now that the child is dead, you get up and eat food. David looked at them and explained his actions with a profound and sorrowful wisdom. While the child was still alive, he said, I fasted and wept because I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? He paused, the finality of death heavy in his words. I will go to him one day, David said, his voice full of a quiet faith. But he will not return to me. He had accepted the judgment of God. He had fought for his son's life with all his heart, but once the decision was made, he submitted to it. His worship was not a celebration. It was an act of surrender, an acknowledgement that God was still God, even in the midst of unbearable pain. After he had eaten, David went to comfort his wife. Bathsheba's grief was just as deep, if not deeper. She had not only lost her child, but her life had been turned upside down. She had lost her first husband, been caught in a royal scandal, and now the child of that union was gone. She was a woman adrift in a sea of sorrow. David sat with her. He held her. He shared in her grief. In that moment of shared loss, in the ashes of their sin and its terrible consequence, a new bond was forged between them. It was a bond not of passion or politics, but of mutual sorrow and survival. And in time, God showed them a sign of his grace. The mercy that had been withheld from the first child was extended to the next. Bathsheba conceived again, and she gave birth to another son. David named him Solomon, a name that means peace. It was a prayer, a hope that this child would bring peace to a house that had been promised turmoil. And the Lord loved the child. He sent a message through the prophet Nathan, giving the boy a second name, Jedediah, which means beloved of the Lord. It was a profound statement of forgiveness and restoration. The sin had been judged, the price had been paid, and now God was planting a seed of new hope in the broken ground of David's family. The boy Solomon, born from the ashes of tragedy, carried a special blessing from God. But the shadow of David's sin was long, and the prophet's curse upon his house was not yet finished. Peace in the kingdom was still a long way off. Years passed. Many, many years. The boy Solomon grew into a young man, quiet and observant, living in the palace but away from the center of power. The kingdom of David, once so strong and united, began to fray at the edges, just as Nathan had prophesied. The sword that was never to depart from David's house did its grim work. There was terrible trouble among David's older sons. There was betrayal, rebellion, and heartbreak. David's handsome and charismatic son, Absalom, rose up against him, stealing the hearts of the people and forcing his own father to flee Jerusalem. David, the mighty king, became a refugee, weeping as he walked barefoot out of his own city. Though David eventually regained his throne, the conflict left deep scars on him and on the nation. The king who returned was not the same man. Now, David was old. The fire that had once burned so brightly in him was now just a faint ember. The great warrior who had faced lions and giants was now a frail man, always cold, huddling under piles of blankets but finding no warmth. He was weak in body and, it seemed, in spirit. His reign was nearing its end, and the question of who would rule after him hung heavy in the air. David had another son, a man named Adonijah. He was born right after Absalom, and in his mind, that made him the rightful heir. He was tall and very handsome, much like his rebellious brother, and he had the same burning ambition. Seeing his father so weak and indecisive, Adonijah thought, "My time has come. I will be king." He began to act like a king. He got himself chariots and horses, with 50 men to run ahead of him, announcing his importance wherever he went. David, his aging father, was too weary to stop him. He never once questioned his son, never asked him, "Why are you doing this?" Adonijah started gathering supporters. He found 2 powerful allies. The first was Joab, the long-serving, ruthless general of David's army. Joab had been loyal to David for decades, but perhaps he saw that David's time was over and decided to back the man he thought would be the next winner. The second was Abiathar, one of the 2 chief priests. With a top general and a high priest on his side, Adonijah felt unstoppable. He decided to make his move. He prepared a great feast, a coronation ceremony in all but name. He went to a place just outside Jerusalem and sacrificed sheep, cattle, and fattened calves. And he invited all the important people, all of his brothers, the king's other sons, and all the royal officials of Judah. But there were a few key people he pointedly did not invite. He did not invite Zadok, the other chief priest. He did not invite Benaiah, the captain of the king's personal bodyguard. He did not invite Nathan the prophet. And most importantly, he did not invite his quiet younger brother, Solomon. He was declaring himself king and treating Solomon as if he didn't even exist. News of the secret coronation feast spread quickly through the circles of power. It reached the ears of Nathan the prophet. Nathan knew this was wrong. He remembered the promise God had made years ago. He remembered the special name, Jedediah, beloved of the Lord. He knew that God's chosen successor was not the arrogant Adonijah, but the overlooked Solomon. Adonijah's coup was a direct challenge not just to David, but to the will of God. Nathan had to act, and he had to act fast. But he was just a prophet. He needed an ally, someone who had access to the king, someone whose own life depended on stopping Adonijah. He knew exactly who to go to. He went to Bathsheba. All these years, Bathsheba had lived in the palace, raising her son. She was no longer the frightened young woman who had been summoned by a king. She was now a mature, wise woman who understood the dangerous politics of the royal court. She was the queen, and more importantly, she was a mother. She knew that if Adonijah became king, his first act would be to eliminate any rivals. She and her son, Solomon, would be seen as a threat. Their lives would be in mortal danger. Nathan found her and laid out the situation urgently. "Have you not heard what is happening?" he asked. "Adonijah has made himself king, and our Lord David knows nothing about it." He spelled out the danger in stark terms. "Now then, let me give you some advice so you can save your own life and the life of your son Solomon." Bathsheba listened, her heart surely pounding with a familiar fear, but this time it was mixed with a steely resolve. She was no longer a passive victim. She was a key player in the future of the kingdom. Nathan laid out the plan. It was a bold and clever strategy. "You must go at once to King David," he instructed her, "and say to him, 'My lord the king, did you not swear to me your servant, saying, Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne? Why then has Adonijah become king?'" The plan was to corner the old king, to force him to remember his promise, a promise he had made to her in private years ago. But Nathan knew that might not be enough. David was old and easily swayed. So he added the second part of the plan. "While you are still there talking to the king," he said, "I will come in after you and confirm what you have said." They would present a united front, a 1-2 punch of persuasion that the weak king could not ignore. The fate of the kingdom now rested on Bathsheba's shoulders. She had to go into the king's chamber and awaken the lion one last time. She had to remind him not just of his promise, but of his power. Bathsheba did exactly as Nathan had said. She went to the king's private chambers. The room was dim and quiet. David was there, lying in his bed, looking impossibly old and frail. A young woman was attending to him, trying to keep him warm, but nothing seemed to work. Bathsheba entered and bowed low before her husband and her king, her face to the ground in a gesture of deep respect. "What is it you want?" the old king asked, his voice thin and weak. Bathsheba rose and spoke, her voice full of a carefully crafted mixture of deference and urgency. "My lord," she began, "you yourself swore to me your servant by the Lord your God, Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne." She reminded him of his sacred oath. Then she delivered the devastating news, framing it as a question of his authority. "But now Adonijah has become king, and you, my lord the king, do not even know about it." She described the great feast, the sacrifices, the powerful men who were with him, Joab and Abiathar. She carefully mentioned the people he had excluded, especially your servant Solomon. She then made her final, brilliant appeal, turning it from a political problem into a personal one. She made him see the consequences for her and for their son. "My lord the king," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "the eyes of all Israel are on you, to learn from you who will sit on the throne of my lord the king after him." She was reminding him of his duty. "Otherwise," she concluded, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "as soon as my lord the king rests with his ancestors, I and my son Solomon will be treated as criminals." She had laid it all out. She had reminded him of his promise, informed him of the rebellion, and warned him of the deadly danger to his own wife and son. She had done her part. Just as she finished speaking, a servant announced, "Nathan the prophet is here to see you." It was perfect timing. Nathan entered and bowed before the king. He played his part perfectly, pretending he knew nothing of Bathsheba's visit. "My lord the king," he asked, with an air of innocent confusion, "have you announced that Adonijah shall be king after you, and that he will sit on your throne? Because he has gone down today and sacrificed many animals. He has invited all the king's sons, the commanders of the army, and Abiathar the priest. Right now, they are eating and drinking with him and shouting, 'Long live King Adonijah.'" Like Bathsheba, Nathan carefully listed who was not invited, "But me your servant, and Zadok the priest, and Benaiah, and your servant Solomon he did not invite." Then he delivered the final, pointed question, designed to spur the old king into action. "Is this something my lord the king has done without letting his servants know who should sit on the throne after him?" The combined testimony of Bathsheba and Nathan worked. It was like a spark landing on dry tinder. Something awoke in David. The fog of old age and weariness lifted for a moment, and the king, the great leader of Israel, reappeared. The lion inside him stirred one last time. He lifted his head, and his voice was suddenly firm, full of its old authority. "Call Bathsheba back in," he commanded. Bathsheba came and stood before him. The king made a solemn vow, not just to her, but before God. "As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble," he declared, his voice ringing with power, "I will surely carry out today what I swore to you by the Lord, the God of Israel. Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne in my place." The promise was now a public decree. It was done. Bathsheba bowed low again, her face to the floor, and said, "May my lord King David live forever." She had done it. She had secured the future. David was now fully energized. He began issuing rapid-fire commands. "Call Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah son of Jehoiada." When they came before him, the king gave his orders, clear and decisive. "Take my royal servants with you. Have my son Solomon mount my own mule and take him down to the Gen spring." Riding the king's personal mule was a powerful, unmistakable symbol. It meant that this person was the king's chosen successor. There, David continued, "Have Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him as king over Israel. Blow the ram's horn and shout, 'Long live King Solomon.' Then you are to come up here with him, and he is to come and sit on my throne and reign in my place. I have appointed him ruler over Israel and Judah." Benaiah, the faithful captain of the guard, replied with a hearty amen. "May the Lord, the God of my lord the king, so declare it." The plan went into motion immediately. A flurry of activity erupted from the palace. Solomon, the quiet son of Bathsheba, was suddenly thrust into the center of a whirlwind. He was placed on King David's own mule. A procession formed around him, Zadok, Nathan, the formidable royal bodyguards, and a growing crowd of people, buzzing with excitement and confusion. They led him down the path to the Gen spring, the main water source for the city. At the spring, Zadok the priest took the sacred horn of oil from the holy tent and poured it on Solomon's head, anointing him as the new king. As the oil ran down his face, the sound of a shofar, a ram's horn, blasted through the valley. It was a sound of alarm, of victory, of coronation. The people who had gathered exploded with joy. They began to shout, their voices echoing off the hillsides. "Long live King Solomon! Long live King Solomon!" The celebration was deafening. They played pipes and cheered with such great joy that the ground itself seemed to shake with the sound. Meanwhile, a short distance away, Adonijah and his guests were just finishing their feast. They heard the noise from the city. Joab, the old general whose ears were trained for the sounds of battle and rebellion, was the first to notice. "What is all that noise in the city?" he asked, a hint of unease in his voice. "Why is the town in such an uproar?" Before anyone could answer, a runner arrived, breathless. It was Jonathan, the son of Abiathar the priest. Adonijah, still confident in his victory, greeted him warmly. "Come in. You are an honorable man. You must be bringing good news." But Jonathan's face was pale. The news he brought was not good. It was disastrous. "Not at all," he gasped. "Our Lord King David has made Solomon king." He quickly recounted everything that had just happened: Solomon riding the king's mule, the anointing at Gin, the blast of the shofar, the wild celebration of the people. "That is the noise you hear from the city," he explained. "And what is more," he added, "the final nail in the coffin of Adonijah's ambition, Solomon has taken his seat on the royal throne. And all the king's officials have gone to congratulate King David, saying, 'May your God make Solomon's name even more famous than yours.' The king even bowed in worship from his bed and said, 'Praise be to the Lord, who has allowed my own eyes to see a successor on my throne today.'" Absolute terror gripped Adonijah and his guests. Their triumphant feast turned instantly to a gathering of panicked conspirators. Their coup had failed. They were now traitors to the new king. In a flash, every one of them jumped up and scattered, running for their lives, abandoning Adonijah to his fate. The arrogant prince was left alone and terrified. He ran to the tabernacle and grabbed hold of the horns of the altar, a sacred place where a person could claim sanctuary. He would not let go, saying, "Let King Solomon swear to me today that he will not put his servant to death with the sword." Word of this reached the new king, Solomon. He showed a wisdom beyond his years. "If he shows himself to be a worthy man, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground," Solomon declared. "But if evil is found in him, he will die." Solomon sent for him, and Adonijah was brought from the altar. He came and bowed low before King Solomon. And Solomon, in an act of mercy, said to him, "Go to your home." The crisis was over. The throne was secure.